the sale was improper, or there was someone had a first right on that land because it was a creditor. So the Gemara goes back and forth on what the rights of the individuals are. And we see generally and consistently that Rav is more Mekel and Shmuel is more Machmir. Shmuel seems to take the position that there are more limitations on what can be recovered, and Rav says he's more sort of liberal. It's almost like the Hillel and Shammai kind of position where Hillel is more lenient and Shammai a little bit more strict. In any event, so we're at the point now where we're going to get some definitive answers to all of these questions. So this is where we start, maybe about 10, 12 lines from the bottom on the last few words of the line, Omar Rava. Omar Rava. So Rava is now going to give us some halachic insight into all these questions. So he says, Hilchasa, the halacha is, Yesh lo mos v'yesh lo shvach, v'af al pi shelo pirish lo as shvach. So what was the first machlokes? We had in the Gemara in Yudaled a machlokes between Rav and Shmuel in a regular case where a person sells property, a person steals the title to property and then sells it to somebody else. So the question there was, what can the person to whom the property was sold recover if the real owner comes and takes it back? In other words, Reuven steals a property from Shimon. Shimon is the owner. Reuven steals title. Shimon is overseas, lives in Eretz Yisrael, whatever. He doesn't know that his property has been stolen. Reuven then sells it to Levi, right? Sells it to Levi. And then a creditor by the name of Yehuda comes and says, wait a minute, this is my property. Or Shimon is told about it and he comes back and says, I'm taking my property back. In any event, Levi is out the property. He doesn't have the property. But in the meantime, while he has owned, so to speak, owned the property, he has tilled the soil, has put down fertilizer, all the other things that improve the value of the property, called shvach. And so he has expended money, and the property is worth more. He sold it for $1,000. The property could be worth $1,200, $1,500 because of his improvement. So all of these are the questions that we've been trying to address and figure out what's going on. So Rav said, if you remember, in Yudalid, Rav said that when it comes to collecting the property, then Levi, who is the rightful, the purchaser, so the purchaser, he can collect his property and he can collect shvach. Yesh lo mos, yesh lo shvach. Shmuel, on the other hand, said he can only collect his money, the $1,000 for the value of the property, but not shvach. Why? And then we introduced the question of mechze karibis. It looks like he is getting interest on the property because he paid $1,000 and he's going to be repaid $1,200. So that $200 appears to be ribis. And we, of course, we asked the question, why does it appear to be ribis? Because he's getting back more value than he gave. All right. So now, of course, there was all kind of intervening discussions in the last few weeks. Well, what happens if he? So one way to answer it, so Shmuel is the one who's most concerned about ribis. Shmuel is the one who addresses the fact that this is ribis, and the Gemara has been trying to go back and forth, and in the last few daf, and ask questions about whether or not this is a valid situation because it's ribis, or is it not valid because it's ribis. So these are the different questions. So comes now Rava.
Rabbi, excuse me.
Yeah.
I still have difficulty with things that appear to be something else.
Yeah.
Can be corrected by just asking the individual, what's this ribis, or why does it look that way? Why do we make such a big deal about something that could be corrected, but it appears differently than what it really is?
So you hit upon an interesting question. Ribis is an Issa D'Oraisa, right? We looked at the pasuk. We saw that Neshech, the Tarbis. So those are Isuri D'Oraisa. One could be an Issa D'Rabanan, one is an Issa, but there's an Issa D'Oraisa called Ribis. So Whether or not it actually is ribis is one question. Something that appears to someone else to be ribis is a second question. So we're talking about two parallel tracks. Is it ribis? Is it really ribis? And the answer is maybe not. So the Issur D'Oraisa might not apply. Okay? The Issur D'Oraisa might not apply because in this case it's not ribis. He's being paid for something he did. That's not ribis. Ribis is value for the use of the money. That's what ribis is. Value for the use of the money, not paying for something that you actually did to improve property for which you left. But we're concerned about appearances. We know this from all the Gemaras we've learned.
He's saying Pirkei Avos, asu siag laTorah. I mean, you have to, rumors can spread. We know that too from events of the past week. I mean,
so appearances count. Appearances count. Maybe not. You'll say, oh, it doesn't count with Klape Shamayim because the Rebbeinu Shalom knows that this transaction was not a transaction of ribis. But what you're misleading someone else to think or see has great value. It's important to us that someone not be misled, because then he's going to go ahead and in the next transaction, he's going to say, wait a minute, Reuven Shimon, look at that transaction. That was a perfectly fine transaction. And it seemed to be that he was getting ribis at the end. Why can't I do the same thing? So
but a simple solution, if you think something that you see is not right, you ask for information. Otherwise, we have for every kind of Morris Iron, you could say, oh, it's guilty because nobody went over and asked him, why did you go into McDonald's? Maybe you went in to go to.
That's exactly the point. But that's exactly the point. If we could always ask the question on the spot immediately and get answers, we might be able to elucidate and understand what the real circumstances are. But the reality is it's not like that. It's not like that. You can't always get the answers on the spot. Therefore, appearances count, and you have to do things that are more or less within the strictures of what is allowable. So the practical answer is ask him, and he'll tell you, it's not ribis, I'm giving you value for value. But the answer is that that's not always the case. If it was always the case, you would be 100% right. We can always resolve the question on the spot. But because we can't, as a practical matter, what appears to be is, what appears to be is by definition, it is. Therefore, without, it's not a talkie, it's a silent movie. And the silent movie looks like there's an exchange of ribis. That is.
Then it drives in towards the issue of if somebody sees something like that, doesn't know the answer, tells somebody else.
Correct.
You have the Lashon Hara connection.
Yeah, well, that one leads to the other. You're absolutely right. And Maris Ayin is Maris Ayin. And Chaim is not that far off when he says Shiur Torah. We want to protect the mitzvahs by creating a fence, right? We have 18 minutes before Shia in order for someone not to violate the Issur D'Oraisa of Shabbos. And we say you bring Shabbos in 18 minutes earlier in order to not have. Why? I mean, if a person knows that Shabbos is at this point in time, that's Shabbos. What's the point? The point is that we're observant of the nuances of what might be, and therefore we find solutions so that what actually might happen, which be an Issur D'Oraisa, doesn't happen. So in this case, it's simple enough to ask. You're right. Ask him, what's this money for? Why are you giving me $200 more than I gave you? But as a practical matter, the Gemara has to deal with what appears and what might be. So that's what we say mechze karibis. And David asked the question weeks ago, but it's mechze karibis. It's not ribis. The terrorist says, you're right. It's not ribis, but it's mechze karibis. So now Rava, watch this answer. Watch this answer. Rava says the halacha is yesh lo mos v'yesh lo shvach v'af al pi shelo piris lo es shvach. Even though he did not announce in advance, I am going to be paying you for everything that's improved on the property. If he says that, and that's already made public, then when he pays him the $1,200 instead of $1,000, it's no longer a question of mechze karibis, because it was never intended to be ribis. It was an agreement made initially that you're getting paid for everything that happens on the property. And to your point, Jay, now it's clear as day. This is not ribbis. This is payment for work. So wait a minute. What do we conclude from this? That the halach is not like Shmuel with regard to ribbis. That mechze ribbis is not ribbis. In other words, don't worry about the mechze ribbis. That's the halakha. Rabbis are saying the halakha is like Rav, that he gets shvach, even if nobody heard any word about I'll pay you for work, anything else. All of a sudden, someone is standing there and watching, and he'll think it's ribbis. Says Rava, don't worry about it. The halacha is not like that. So Rashi says hilchasa beplukta kamaisa in the original machlokes between Rav and Shmuel, where this whole ribbis question came up. Yesh lo mos, yesh lo shvach. Afapi de lo pirish. The less love the Shmuel the omer shvach tzorech limlo. And the halacha is not like Shmuel, who says that shvach has to be announced in advance. So rule number one says Rava, halacha is like Rav, not like Shmuel, and we're not worried about ribbis. Okay, that's one halacha. First halacha he gives. He gives three halachas. Second halacha. Last week we introduced a wrinkle to the whole discussion of someone who steals property and sells it. And what did we say? The subject was that the buyer knew it was stolen. In other words, the first instance that we spoke about several weeks ago, he didn't know. Reuven sold him a piece of property. It turns out Reuven stole it, but Shimon didn't know. Here, Hikar Bo She'ena Shalo, if he recognized that it was not, that it didn't belong to Reuven, oh, wait a minute, this property belongs to, or whatever, Shimon. He's overseas. So Levi is the buyer. So he knew that Reuven wasn't the owner of the property, yet he bought it from him. You might think, buyer beware, and it should be the buyer's consequence here. Says Rava, Hikar Bo She'ena Shelo B'Locha, Mos Yeshlo, Shvach Ein Lo. So there's a machlokes between Rav and Shmuel. Rav says that you get your money back, but not the shvach. Shmuel says you don't even get your money back. We don't even give you your money back if you were a sort of a willing participant in this unsavory affair. You can't go back and get your money. So the halacha is like Rav, that you get your money back and not shvach. So that's another nail in Shmuel's coffin, so to speak, is that Rava doesn't hold like Shmuel here either.
So doesn't that raise another interesting question? Because usually on matters of Mamonos, Shmuel reigns supreme, even when he argues with Rav?
Say it again, on matters of?
Mamonos, on civil matters, monetary questions, economic matters.
Right.
Usually they go with Shmuel over Rav on such matters, and Rav is on Isurei Malacha. So
Right.
why, this is an unusual case where they're siding with Rav over Shmuel in a matter of finances, economics.
Right.
Isn't that unusual? What was it that made Rava feel that he could go against the usual?
Well, let me say this. First of all, you know that the parallel is very interesting because in the machlokes between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, the halacha is like Beis Hillel, except in three instances when the halacha is like Beis Shammai. And again, why are you more machmir in those cases than other? I guess the answer here is because from Rava's perspective, all of these three cases would chill commerce. In other words, yes, the halacha might be like Shmuel in most other cases, but when you look at these three cases, each of them would be a situation where if you held like Shmuel, then you're telling the buyer to beware. Okay, so you're telling the buyer that he needs to know in advance everything there is to know, otherwise he suffers the penalty, even though he may not be the crooked party. Let's use the term crooked because we're talking about Gezela, right? As opposed to Baal Chov. In the case of Gezela, he is not. Yes, okay. The second circumstance you can say that he knew about the theft, so maybe he should be held accountable. But all of these cases would chill commerce if we said that buyer beware in all cases. that if you have a seller who dupes you, you're out of luck. In the first case, where the buyer knew nothing, he knew nothing, and all of a sudden he finds himself on the short end of a purchase that he made, and the hard work and the money that he put into producing stuff on the ground. And if you were to hold like Shmuel, you would say, you know what, sorry, you're out of luck for anything you did. Then you'd be putting him in a difficult situation. You'd be putting the buyer in a difficult situation. So that's the strain that goes through these three. I would have to think about all the other cases where we hold like Shmuel and Maimonides to see how they stack up against this, David. But what the common denominator of these three seems to be that they are all cases in which if you held like Shmuel, you'd be limiting the abilities of a person to engage in transactions. That's what it seems to be. I don't know if that's the definitive answer I'm giving you. I'm just saying that's what it seems to be. Now let's look at the third one and see if that in fact fits the pattern. So that's the second one. Now what's the third one? The third one is achrayus tos sofahu. Remember we had a discussion whether if you have a shtar between two people and it's totally void of any language having to do with security. In other words, there's no security to a property, nothing at all listed. So the question there became whether or not that was legitimate or whether that was a tos sofer. We introduced the fact that the sofer, he's the standard writer of contracts, and he should know that these clauses are automatic in every contract. So the halacha there is achrayus, that putting in language of achrayus, of responsibility, in other words, security is tos sofer. If it's missing, it was not meant to be missing. It's the mistake of the sofer. Bein b'shtori halvo ubein b'shtori mekech umemker. So whether it's a loan or a transaction of a purchase, it's always a tos sofer. Again, says Rashi, the less lom de Shmuel, and this is not like Shmuel, the Omer shibud tzorach limlach, because he says that in order to have a shibud, you have to actually announce it, or you have to say it specifically. So this is the third case, and again, it goes to the same question I think we just were talking about, is that you're going to disadvantage this party by assuming that he was naive. I mean, if I lend you money and I want to do you a taiva, okay, and I lend you, let's say, a substantial sum, am I just going to rely on your good graces to pay me back, or I'm going to find some security to help me that if something goes wrong, I can recover my money? So the Gemara says, when we learned the Gemara previously, the Gemara says that people don't take risks like that. A person doesn't take a risk and loan you a lot of money and say, do me a favor and be a good guy, make sure you pay me back. And we know as a practical matter in life, things happen and the guy doesn't have money. And then all of a sudden you feel bad. And again, that's going to chill commerce, because a person's going to say, I like you, but I don't like you enough to lend you $10,000 without a pledge. Okay, so we have to find some way to bridge that difference, that I should do you a taiva, or I should give you money when you need it, not as a taiva, but as a loan. But at the same time, I should have security myself on that loan. So the Gemara says that we go against Shmuel, because Shmuel says that it's not Torah sofer. If it's not there, it's because the parties didn't agree. Whereas Rav says, no. They always agree that it has to be security. If it wasn't written, it's the sofer's mistake. But you can never assume that the lender wouldn't require security. So that's the third sort of situation in this parallel, which shows that the halacha is like Rav, not Shmuel. And again, showing that Shmuel, who is the more machmir here, we don't hold like him in these cases, because if we held like him consistently, it would hurt the relationships of people in commerce. And as much as the Torah, we follow the mitzvahs of the Torah to the letter, we know that the Torah doesn't want to put people in circumstance that is against their interest. So we want you to be a good guy. You have money. help somebody else, but make sure that you're protected as well. So in that case, Shmuel was a little bit too strict in who he protected. He protected the borrower more than he did the lender, and that's against public interest. That's against public interest. It's like in the criminal justice system, we say that the criminal is given more rights than the victim. In other words, we have to protect the criminal, but what about the victim? What about the guy who was actually hurt? Don't we have to protect him? Of course we have to protect him. In fact, we should be first to protect him before we protect the criminal. But somehow, in that balance, it doesn't always look that it's equal. But anyway, as far as this halakha is concerned, so now we've answered all these questions of the last few daf, but the most important thing I think of this is for us to realize the halakha is not like Shmuel in Mechse Karibis, because that would seem to be our focus. Remember, again and again and again, every circumstance, does it fit Shmuel or does it not fit Shmuel? And every case we always try to correct it that Shmuel should be on the right side, meaning that it's not Ribis. We always find a way to differentiate between a case that seems to be against Shmuel and saying, no, it's not like that. It's really not like that. Comes Rava and says, wait a minute, no, Shmuel is not right. That this whole question of Mechse Karibis is something that we just don't get too concerned with. So David, you were the first one to ask that question when Rashi said Mechse Karibis in the case of a Goslin, right? When we asked that question. And the teretz is, you're right, that Mechse Karibis, it's not Ribis. Yes, we have to worry about it, but not to the nth degree that becomes an Issa D'Oraisa and we can't, everything gets frozen in its way. It's not like that. So that's the halakha like Rav, not like Shmuel, that Mechse Karibis is not something that we get overly, let's say, wrought over, that we get overly concerned with. Sure, we should try to make everything at least appear to be right, but we're not worried about this Mechse Karibis issue as much as Shmuel wants to raise.
Rabbi,
So Rava was a couple of generations after Rav and Shmuel, so there may have been an opportunity to observe the effect on the marketplace of what Shmuel's position would have been.
What Shmuel's consequence was, right?
Not to be practical, yeah.
Right, exactly, right. They saw that how that affected commerce at the time. So Rava says we can't live with that, especially when it's not a derisive. It's just Mexico. It's not a derisive.
Rabbi, the third case troubles me because what in effect we're saying is that you either have to give tzedakah to somebody who doesn't have anything to make them a loan. If they want to start a business and they don't have anything, you've got to give them tzedakah and it's a gift, or you have to have a contract where you're a partner and you get a return, because you can't loan him the money for that and expect something back, because you're always assuming that there's got to be collateral. And if somebody doesn't have the collateral at that point in time, if they don't have the ability to have collateral, you're dissuading a loan in that sense. So you're making it tzedakah instead of or a business transaction instead of a loan.
Well, Michael, you hit on something very interesting, because in the real world, and I can tell you this from personal experience, when someone comes to borrow money and he wants it as a loan, 100%, no question about it. As a practical matter, he does not have collateral. He has nothing to give you as collateral, right? I mean, the halacha is he can't give you the shirt on his back because you have to give him the shirt on his back, right? He can't give you things that he needs for life because that's not allowed.
Right.
So you have a choice to make. I can say, really, I'm sorry, I really can't make this loan. I can't give you the money. Of course, that's against our Torah that says you should help someone in his time of need. But yet, I'm not a fool. You want a lot of money, and how am I going to secure my interest, right? So, two things. When a person has something of collateral and it's not included in an agreement, then we make the assumption it was meant to be included in the agreement, and both parties had agreed to it, except that it wasn't memorialized. And that's the fault of the scribe, not of the two parties, and therefore we attribute that secured interest to the deal.
So de facto, after the fact, de facto, it was there.
It was there. Now, there's an interesting question. What happens when it's not there? How do you look at it? So I had occasion to be involved in a circumstance like that, where a person was very upset because he had given a nice sum of money as a loan and he didn't have collateral to take back. And so therefore there was a good deal of animus between the parties. And it took a lot of persuasion to get the lender to understand that what he was really doing was an act of tzedakah, not a matter of commerce. Because you're right, at some point in time, either you hold them accountable or you say to yourself, listen, if I'm giving a loan, I get no collateral, you're smart enough to know, am I going to get this back? I'm hoping I'm going to get it back, but I have no way of knowing that I'm going to get it back. So you need to already be saying to yourself, if I'm going to do this, let me do it with my eyes wide open, that I may be giving tzedakah and not making a loan. And that will prevent the harboring of bad feelings. If you can't get over that, then either you shouldn't be making the loan or saying, I can't give you $1,000, I can only give you $200, because that's the limit of what I'm prepared to sort of give up as tzedakah. And unfortunately, in our, among our Jewish brethren who want to keep the mitzvahs, this becomes a matter of concern, is that how are we going to ensure that people will continue to give tzedakah? So tzedakah is tzedakah. I have money, I want to give it tzedakah, no problem. But where I don't have, I've exhausted my tzedakah. Now I have to think business. How am I going to give you the money if I don't have collateral? That is an issue. It is a halachic issue on how to deal with that. And of course, that's why we have gemach and we have all these other things that help sort of smooth over the circumstance. But if you don't have collateral and you know your brother's hurting, either you say, listen, I'm prepared to give tzedakah, and if I get it back, I get it back. But if not, I did the right thing. Or you have to say, I can't do it. Someone else has to do it. It's a tough situation.
But it's halachically correct that if somebody wants to do that and say, I'm going to invest in your business and, I will get a return up to X if you reach a certain factor, that's okay because it's not ribis. And so
Right.
you can structure it that way as opposed to.
Exactly right. And basically, that's the principle of a heter iska. The principle of the heter iska, which allows loans, is that you structure it not as a loan with interest, but as a, like you pointed out, a participation in the success of the business. If the business isn't successful, then okay. But I'm doing it as a business transaction. That if I'm successful, then I'm sort of a shutaf. I'm a partner in what I'm doing. I mean, when you buy stock in a Jewish company, right? You're buying stock. It's kind of the same thing. Is that you're banking on the success of the people doing the business. It's a business transaction, which again, many times in those circumstances they write a heter iska just so that you know that that's what it is. But in practice, without the heter iska, it's the same thing. It is that, right? But the border between a loan and tzedakah is, that's a very tenuous one, which is why we try to be careful when we do this under halacha, that we do it carefully, that it doesn't become problematic.
Rabbi,
Okay.
Rabbi.
Yeah.
So getting back to what you said earlier, if you didn't memorialize that there is collateral, but there is collateral
Available.
we assume that it was included.
Correct.
In the, okay. So
Correct.
what happens if they didn't memorialize the collateral and the person sold the collateral before the loan was paid back? Who belongs to that collateral?
Okay, that's what that really
Right.
is the central of our Gemara, because in
Right.
our Gemara, if you own something and it was pledged to me, that's called achrayus. You pledged to me as collateral, and then you went ahead and sold it, and then you couldn't pay me back. I can go to the buyer, to the person that you sold it to, and say, I'm a Baal Chov. I'm a creditor here.
Even
I
if
have
it's
rights.
not been memorialized.
Because we impute that it was memorialized. We impute it. And that's the halacha that Rava is saying, that we impute the memorialization of collateral. It's exactly the point.
Okay.
Okay, good. Okay, now, as if we didn't have enough to think about, the Gemara is going to add another layer to the complications of what we've been talking about. Because that's what the Gemara does. The Gemara now says, okay, now that you're satisfied with the way this Gemara came out, let's twist it a little bit and let's see whether with that twist we change our thinking. So take a look here. Boy minei Shmuel mirav. Now remember, the relationship was that Shmuel was Rab's Talmud. So comes Shmuel and he asks the following question of his Rebbe, of Rab. Chaza v'locha mibalim harishonim. Get a load of this. We have a righteous gamet. We have a righteous gamet. What does he do? He steals a piece of land, steals a title. He sells it. Reuben sells it to Shimon. Right? Levi's the owner. Reuben sells it to Shimon. Now, Reuben is the Gazlan, and he says, you know what? I have a conscience. What I did wasn't really right. So what does he do? What does Reuben do? He goes to Levi, and to who? The real owner, and says, Levi, I want to buy your property. Remember, Levi could be off somewhere else. He doesn't even know that Reuben sold his property to a third guy. But he goes to Levi and says, you know what? Your property is worth $1,000. Here, I want to buy your property. So what do we think he's trying to do? We think he's trying to buy the property to make good on his sale to Shimon. He sold it to Shimon improperly because he stole it, he stole the title. But now he wants to buy it so that the title actually is his. And we think that the reason he's doing it is what? To make good on his sale to Shimon, right? That's what's going on here. Zok the Gemara Azai. What's the halacha? What do we say? What's the circumstance if Reuven, the Gazlan, who sold it to Shimon, goes to the real owner Levi and says, I'm buying your property? Levi doesn't even know that Reuven sold it to Shimon. He doesn't have to know. It doesn't matter. He doesn't know that his property's already been sold. He goes to Levi and says, I'm buying your property. Zak the Gemara Azai. All Ma'aleh. So Rav answered him. What did he say? Ma machalo rishon l'sheni. What did the Gazlan sell to the person, to Shimon, who he sold it to? Kol zechu shetova liyado. So Rav makes a pronouncement that he sold him all the rights that Reuven, the Gazlan, would have. He sold him all his rights. So in other words, Reuven, what rights does Reuven have? If he steals a piece of property, he has no rights. But Rav is imputing that if he should ever have any rights, those rights he sold to Shimon. So in other words, there's your answer. If he sold him all his rights, then if Reuven then buys the property from Levi, he sold him those rights. Therefore, it's Shimon's legitimately. It's no longer a clouded piece of property, clouded title. It's now a total legitimate property, as if Reuven bought it from Levi before he sold it to Shimon, right? If Reuven buys a piece of property from Shimon, and then he turns and sells it to Levi, if Reuven buys a piece of property from Levi, and then he turns and sells it to Shimon, we wouldn't be having this discussion. It's 100% okay. What happened here is it was the other way around. Reuven sold it to Shimon when he didn't have title, and then he buys it from Levi and he has title, and Rav says that title passes right to Shimon. The title.
It was a short sale.
It was a short sale. Right.
He sold what he didn't have.
Right. So you and I know the legal term, but for everybody else,
interesting.
What's a short sale? It means you're buying something you don't have, but then you fill in the blanks, and all of a sudden you have it. So when you have it, we say Lemafreya, he meant to sell it to him with the corrected title. That's Rav's answer to Shmuel. So this is a twist on our Gemara. Our Gemara was talking about a Gazlan who sold a piece of property, and then the real owner came back and said, what did you do here? You sold my property? I'm collecting my property back. That was our previous circumstance. Now the circumstances change where the property is no longer considered stolen because Ruvain made good on the property, and Rav says the title passes right to Shimon. Well, let's take a look at Rashi. Amalei. Lo motza la'afuke kishemocher mochalo kol zchus shetova liyado ukishalachla locha elakadeshi mukuyim biad elakeach. What is Rashi saying? What's the kasha here? Well, I said the Gemara, I said it over, but what's the kasha? Why not? The kasha is because you might think, listen to this, you might think that when the Goslin legitimately bought the property from Levi, he can go back to Shimon and say, this is my property. Just like Levi would have rights to go to Shimon, right? Shimon bought the property from the Goslin. Levi would go back to Shimon and say, what? You have my property. You have no right to my property. I want it back. You might think then when Ruvain pays Levi, he inherits Levi's rights to go back and retrieve the property from Shimon. You see what's going on here? That's the kasha. The kasha is if Ruvain sells it to Shimon and he was not authorized to sell it, and then he buys it from the real owner, can he go back to Shimon and say, I'm taking this property back? Just like Levi would have been allowed to take the property, I'm taking the property back. That's the kasha. Says Rav answers Shmuel and says, no. When he sold him the property, he sold him all the rights to the property. What does that mean? That means if Ruvain, the Goslin, actually buys the property from Levi, it automatically goes to Shimon. So Rav's answer is you can't do a double take and go back to the person who you sold it to improperly and retrieve it and say, sorry, my friend, it's not yours, it's mine, I bought it. Right? I mean, that's the chokhmah here.
Rabbi, does the original owner, having not known that it was taken and stolen illegally and finds out afterward, although sold it to the Ganef after the fact, does he have the right to annul that transaction when he finds out what's there?
No, and it sounds interesting, but the answer is no. Why not? Because the Gemara says that when the Goslin sold the property, it was never a sale. Rashi there says right away, it's a loan. He never sold them the property. It was never a valid sale. It's as if he made him a loan, which is why the whole question of ribbis came up, because it was a loan. So now, even if Levi finds out later, what? You stole my property and sold it? How dare you? It doesn't matter, because now the transaction is a legal transaction and had nothing to do with the improper sale of stolen property. So he can't come back and say, I nullify the sale because you stole my property. That was never a sale.
So theoretically, you could correct that theft by virtue of doing a subsequent purchase.
Correct. And that's what Rav is answering Shmuel. But it's not as simple as it looks on its face, because the argument against that outcome is that Ruvain, the Goslin, goes to Shimon, the buyer, his buyer, and says, you know what? Levi could have come here and taken this property back. I am now Levi. I bought it from Levi. I'm Levi. I want the property back. That's the Hava Minna. You might think that he steps into the shoes of Levi and says, I want it back. Teretz says no. Now, lest we think that the Gemara is thinking of doing a subterfuge, keep in mind that in every case, whatever the outcome, if he takes the property back, he has to pay him for it. This isn't going to be a case where the buyer is going to be duped. In other words, Shimon, who bought the property, he wants this property. It's a very attractive property. It's next to his other properties. It's of value to him. If he loses the property, he gets his money back. It's not as if he's out everything. He gets his money back, except that he doesn't want his money back. He wants the property. So we're dealing with an issue here, not where the buyer is going to be harmed because he's going to lose everything, he bought a stolen property and then he loses the property and doesn't get anything. The kasha here only is, does he have to relinquish the property or can he keep the property? So that's our discussion, because he wants this property, not the money. Obviously, if he wanted the money, he wouldn't have bought the property. He bought the property because the property had an advantage to him. The question is, can Reuven, the Goslin, say, I want the property back? Says Rav, no, because what you did is you sold him all your schusim, all your rights in the property. If you go ahead and clean up your mess by buying it from a Levi, then it automatically goes to Shimon the buyer. That's what this Gemara is telling us.
Rabbi,
Now, why is that the case? Now we're going to get into the real detail. Why do we say this? That when he sold it to him, he sold it him with all rights, and he can't come back and say, I want to be in the shoes of Levi, of the real owner, and I want it back. Why not? So it's a machlokes between Mazutra and Rav Ashi. Interesting machlokes. Mazutra Omar, nichaleid lo nikre gazlona. Now this now goes to what we call public opinion. Okay, public opinion is important. People have a reputation. They don't want to harm that reputation. So Marzutra says a person doesn't want to be called a Goslin. You don't want the term Goslin hung around your neck for the rest of your life. Oh, this guy, he stole a piece of property and he wanted to make profit. So therefore, says Rav, Marzutra says that when you actually buy the property legitimately, you're legitimizing the sale because you don't want to be called a Goslin. Because what did he do? He forged a certificate and he sold it. Now he's a Goslin. Maybe nobody knows yet, but he is a Goslin. So he wants to legitimize that I'm not a Goslin. Therefore, he bought the property. Says Rav, he's protecting his reputation. Rav Ashi Omer, Rav Ashi says, no. Nichel, it's similar but not the same. Nichele the lake of Behem Nusa. A person wants to stand by his trust. Not just a question of Goslin. If I make a pronouncement to you, I want you to believe me. In my business, I need veracity. I need to know that if I say something and a person acts on it, forget about being a Goslin. Just the fact that I'm a truthful guy, I have veracity, you'll believe me when I tell you something.
But you're splitting hairs. What's the difference, really?
What's that?
You're splitting hairs, I think. What's the difference, really?
Okay, the Gemara will show us a different time. You're right. That's why I said it's very similar. But being called a Goslin or standing by your trust, maybe they're two sides of the same coin.
We say tov, shem tov, mishemen tov, right? I mean, so it's
Right.
all, I think, so similar, All right, I'll wait.
No, but don't you see a little bit of a difference between a good name and a Goslin?
No, he can't afford to be labeled a Goslin because of his business interests, but he also cares about his name. It's kind of one and the same. I mean, I'll wait.
No, I understand, but just so that we understand, right? I understand your point, but just think about it. A person can have a disreputable name without being a Goslin, right?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so that's the slight difference. We're going to see the difference.
Right. Legally, you can't show he did anything wrong, and maybe he didn't do anything wrong, but he has a bad reputation.
That's exactly right. So according to Rav Ashi, it's protecting his reputation because he made a pronouncement, so he wants to make good on the pronouncement by buying the land. In either
Rabbi,
case,
the paper trail is not clear to me. If the person forges a document that says he sells this property, that Levi sold it to him, and then he sold it to Shimon. If there's paperwork, it'll show that the Goslin sold it to Shimon. Now, so when he goes to buy it from Levi to legitimize it, the guy will pull up the paper and say, "Hey, wait a minute, you don't own this. Shimon owns it."
right,
And
so-
then is that Levy finds out that things are not quite kosher there?
You'd be right probably today with computers when you can compress a button. But remember, in the time of the Gemara, if an owner lived thousands of miles away and he owned a piece of property, and Ruvain saw an opportunity, he says, my friend Levi lives in Eretz Yisrael, I'm in Bavel, he'll never know. He'll never know. I'm going to go ahead and sell this to Shimon and everything will be fine. It'll never happen. Then he grows a conscience and he says, wait a minute, I did something improper. I'm going to go back to my friend Levi. Now, there wasn't a computer that you can pull up and say, wait a minute, this isn't legitimate title. So no one knows. Shimon doesn't know. But so Reuven says, I want to do the right thing. I have a reputation to protect. I don't want to be a Goslin. I'm going to go ahead and write a letter by Air Express to my friend Levi, and I'm going to give him $1,000 for this property because that's what I know he wants, and I'm going to own the property. Now I can sleep at night because no one's going to call me a Goslin, right? It'll never happen because now Shimon owns the property legitimately. So in other words, it's the sequence of events that may be out of order, but the answer is who's going to know? In other words, today you might say, if someone looked it up and after the fact, they're going to say, Reuven, how did you even think of selling me this property? You didn't have title in 2020 to sell me a piece of property. You only got title in 2021. Okay, we go to court, this, that, the other, whatever. But in the time of the Gemara, this was not, in other words, the order of events was less critical than the fact that the outcome was correct. Now, I'm not saying it's legitimate. This is not a legitimate way of doing business. But first you should buy it.
Retroactively, he's trying to correct something
That's correct.
he knows about. So why can't that work?
Jay, what do we call that? We call that tshuva. he's doing tshuva. He wants to go ahead and correct something that he created improperly. So he's doing it out of order, but then that's the kasha here. The kasha, the hava mina of the kasha is, if he tricked Shimon and sold him a piece of property. Now, remember what I said. This is not about stealing money, because if he takes the property, he's got to reimburse him. But let's say Reuven sold it to Shimon, and Reuven is a Goslin, and he sold it to Shimon. Okay, then he grew a conscience and said, you know what? I really want this property. I heard that they're going to be mining, and this property may have oil under it. I want to get this property back. So he goes ahead and he buys the property. Now, if he has the right of Levi, what was Levi's right? Levi's right was to go back to Shimon and say, Shimon, get off my property. It's my property. You want to get your money back? Go back to the seller, get your money back because this is my property. Says the Gemara, he can do that. Now, Reuven has bought the property from Levi, and Reuven is a smart guy, and he says, you know what? I just bought the property from Levi. I'm inheriting Levi's rights. And one of Levi's rights is to go back and take the property back. I'm going to do that. Says Rav, no way. When you sold it to Levi, you sold it with all the rights. What are those rights? That's a machlokes between Mar Zutra and Rav Ashi. Mar Zutra says the rights are because you don't want to be called a Goslin, and Rav Ashi says because you want to stand by your word. So those two are the principles which guides Rav's halacha. When Rav says you're selling it with all the rights, it's because of Mar Zutra and Rav Ashi. It's because there are inherent reasons why you want to do it. I don't want to be known as a thief. I don't want people calling me a thief. So that in itself is the answer to the question.
But Rabbi, look at the other side of the perspective. Same situation. People are far apart. They know that there's an assayer that goes to the property, sees that there's oil. The guy knows that Levi is is having some difficulties. He understands that it's higher. He says, I know what he'll take for it, even though he doesn't know that this is a difference. So he ends up selling it for a higher amount, then buys it for a lesser amount from the original owner. Knowing all that, that's protected because it was the seller's responsibility to find out that the assayer had come and assessed the value and the value had increased?
Okay, so you're talking on a moral issue, an ethical issue, not a halachic issue. This is an ethical issue. If I know that your property is far more valuable because it has oil on it, and I offer you a price because you live in another country and don't know the value of your own property,
But
that's an ethical question.
no, but I've already sold it for a higher amount.
But
I've
that's
stolen and sold it.
But
And then
that's
I'm
not a
gonna buy
sale. That's not a sale. That was an invalid sale. It never happened.
No, because you're going to come back and correct it because you're going to buy it from the original owner for whatever he wants with a lack of knowledge. So you sold something that had more value. So you made a profit on it by taking it from the original owner, stealing it, selling it for a higher amount, and then going back to the original owner and trying to buy it for what he perceived the original value to be, which was less than what you sold it for.
Okay, so the fact pattern is that Ruvain sold it to Shimon for $1,000 as a practical matter, and then now I'm only giving you an example of when I said there's oil under it. I mean, again, that's a curveball. Let's say there's no oil under it. He sold it for $1,000, and then his wife sits him down and says, "Ruvain, what did you do here? You sold a piece of property that you don't own. Do you really want to do this? You're a very respectable man. You have a shidduch to do with your daughter. Do you really want to go ahead and be known as a thief?" So he sleeps on it and he says to his wife, "Rivka, you're right. I don't want to do this." He goes back to Levi and he says, "Levi, you have a piece of property. It's near mine, whatever. I know you don't need it. You're in Eretz Yisrael. I'm buying this." He doesn't undercut him. He pays the $1,000. In other words, the same $1,000.
In this case, there's no
profit. There's no profit.
No profit.
Exactly. So each case has its own standards. Some of them are ethical issues, but on the halachic question. So let's say everything is equal. He sold it for $1,000. He's going to buy it for $1,000. Everything is shava b'shava. He didn't do it for other motivation other than he just wanted to correct his mistake. So Rav says he can correct his mistake, and when he does so, the property legitimately belongs to Shimon. Why is that a chiddush? It's a chiddush because you might have had a hava amina. You might have had a hava amina that Ruvain can say to Shimon, "You know what? I'm giving you your money back." And Levi says, "What do you mean you're giving me my money back?" He can come to him and say, "I did something that wasn't quite correct. I sold you a piece of property that I didn't own. I now own it. I've now taken the rights of the real owner and I want to exercise those rights. What are those rights? The right that I can come back and take my property back. Because when I sold you the property, I didn't really sell you a property. It wasn't mine to sell. I made you a loan. Now I own the property, and as a property owner, I have rights on my property. I want to get it back." And Levi's going to go to court and is going to say to the Bezdin, "Is this right? Can I do this? Can he do this to me? Sells me a piece of property, takes it back. That's not right." So the Bezdin will grapple with this, and absent Rav's pronouncement, they would say, "You know something? I think he has that right. I think he has the right to come in and take his property back, because if Levi had come in to take his property back, you would have had no choice but to give it to him. He just bought it from Levi. He has Levi's rights. You're out of luck." Says Rav, that's not the halacha. The halacha is that when he bought it, he didn't buy it and step into Levi's shoes. He bought it to correct what he had done before, either because of Mar Zutra, that he doesn't want to be called a Goslin, or of Ashi, that he wants to have a reputation of veracity. So Rav is taking the interpretations of Mar Zutra and Rav Ashi and imputing it into this case and saying that the bottom line of this case is that when a person makes good on a previously flawed transaction, when he sold him the flawed transaction, he sold them all rights with that transaction. And one of those rights is that if the property is properly bought later on, it's as if he sold it correctly to Shimon. That's the pronouncement here that Rav is making. In other words, he's connecting all the dots, telling you what the Havamin is, but telling you no, and the reason is because of Marzutra and Ravashi. So let's just try to get through this. Okay, this is a wonderful discussion. So, Frek the Gemara Chaim Ma Benayu. What is the difference between Marzutra and Ravashi? They seem to be saying the same thing. One says he doesn't want to be a Gazlan, and one says he wants to be a true to his word. What's the difference? Ika Benaya. Okay, here we have another twist. You think we're finished? Ika Benaya, the Muslokeya. You know what the difference is? Shimon dies. With this whole transaction, Shimon has died. Look at Rashi. So Rashi first says the lo likra gazlono shel yacharpenu lokeach zeh kishiyotze nigzol miyado, that it shouldn't be a shameful for him when he has to give up the property. If he can a gazlan, he's going to go around the streets and say, you know what, Reuben's a gazlan. He sold me a stolen piece of property. The kachchozo lahame b'makro. Therefore, he goes back to Levi, the original owner, and he buys it so that Shimon shouldn't go around besmirching him and saying you're a gazlan. Now, the muslokeach, what's the benayu? The lokeach dies. Look at the last Rashi on the bottom. After the Gazlan bought it from the Balim, which means Reuven bought it from Levi, now the Gazlan, the Nigzal, Shimon dies. His sons inherit. His sons inherit him. So now Reuven says, wait a minute. I sold it to Shimon, and I'm buying it from Levi because I don't want to be called a Gazlan. But Shimon isn't going to call me a Gazlan anymore. He died. Shimon died. I'm not worried about being called a Gazlan. Says the Gemara, that's the chilek. That if the Lokeach dies and his inheritors take the property, then Reuven may never be concerned about being called a Gazlan anymore because he was only worried about Shimon, not about Shimon's inheritors. Says the Gemara, Ika Benaya de Mus Lokeach. Manda Omandi Chale Likre Gazlona, according to Mazutra, who says that he doesn't want to be called a Gazlan. Okay, top of page Tezainam at Aleph. Homesle, he dies. Rashi, Homes Lokeach. Penu owed. Who's going to shame him? Right? He's not worried about the inheritors. Who's going to shame him? Shimon died. He never considered to worry about the inheritors. He only wanted to make sure that it was a legitimate transaction as long as Shimon was alive. Lola achamoso, but not after his death, says Rashi. So what do we see from here? If you say that the principle is Gazlonis, no more Gazlonis. Shimon died. He can't be called a Gazlan. Reuven is going to go to the inheritors and he's going to say, my dear friends, I want the property back. I'm taking this chusum of Levi, right? The original owner, this chusum of Levi. I want my property back. I'm going to give you your money. I'm not going to steal you, but give me my property back.
Why, couldn't the inheritors know the story?
Maybe, Jay, maybe. But in this discussion right now, the answer is no. Right now, they don't know for nothing. They know they inherited a piece of property. And now Reuben's going to come and say, my friends, I'm sorry, but this was really not a valid transaction. Here's your money. You're not going to lose a nickel. Here's your $1,000. I want my property back. According to Mazutra, that would be the outcome. Umanda Oma Nichale, the lake in Bahamnusa, but according to Rav Ashi, right? Top of Tazayin, according to Rav Ashi, who says that we're worried about veracity, Bahadabani Nama Nicha the lake in Bahamnusa, that he wants veracity even from the inheritors. So, in other words, talking about splitting hairs, if according to Marzutra, the issue of Gazlonis, he says, only goes to the buyer, not to his second generation. According to Rav Ashi, the principle of Hamnusa, of veracity, does go to the second generation. And if he gives them back the money, then they're going to say, wait a minute. They're not going to know he stole it. Jay, they're not going to know he stole it. They're just going to know that he made a pledge and now he's a welcher. He's coming back and say, I want the property back. I'm giving you your money. But they say, but we really like this property. We want to build a retirement home on this property. Sorry, it's my property. Here's your money. Go find another property. So the Hamnusa issue, according to this discussion, would remain. The Gazlonis issue would not remain. So the difference, Chaim, between the two is, in this circumstance, if the Lokeach dies, then that's the difference. Now, okay, so we're a little bit running, but let me just. The Gemara isn't going to end this way. We're going to get into this Gemara, but let me point out a very interesting question that the Rishonim ask. Look at the Rashi again on Daf Tes Vav Amud Beis on the bottom. What was the sequence of events? La'acher shalokcha gazla min habalim, after the Gazlu bought it from the Balim, the Lokeach dies. When did he die? When it was already legitimately in the possession of the Gazlan. Correct? That's what the Rashi says. Fragging the Meforshim on Rashi, if that's the sequence of events, how can you interpret that he's not worried about Gazlonis because of the inheritors? When he bought it, it was legitimately in the hand of of Shimon, so that it is Gazlonis. Right? It's a tremendous question, because if he bought it when it was already in the hands of the buyer, and after he bought it from the legitimate owners, Shimon died. By the time Shimon died, Reuven was already legitimately owned the property. If he owned the property at that point, how could you not call him a Gazlan if he goes back to the inheritors? It was already established in the lifetime of the Shimon that he would have been a Gazlan. In other words, listen to the finer point. When Lokeach dies, is the kasha, makes a big difference. Because if he dies after Reuven already legitimately bought it,
yeah,
right? Now he wants to go back. Of course he's a Gazlan.
same situation.
Of course he's a Gazlan. Therefore, the Rishonim and Tosfos and all the other Rishonim say, no, he died before the transaction took place. If he died before the transaction went place, then who are the legitimate owners now? The Yarshim. So when he bought it to legitimize it, he's not worried about the Yarshim. He's not worried about the Yarshim that will call him a Gazlan, but he's worried about Shimon, that Shimon will call him a Gazlan. But if Shimon died after he already bought it, Shimon would call him a Gazlan, right? And that's what he doesn't want. So therefore, the Rishonim say that Rashi's interpretation is not correct, that he didn't die after, he died before Reuven legitimately bought the property. If he died before, that when he buys the property, who owns the property? The Yarshim. And Mar Zutra says, from the Yarshim, I'm not worried about being called a Gazlan. It's a fine nuance, but you see the difference.
He
When
also
he
could
died,
have-
it's important.
He also could have died in the middle of that transaction.
The important thing is, did he die at the point when it was a legitimate transaction? If it was already legitimately owned and he was still alive, then he would have called him a Gazlan if he tricked him. So it shouldn't be allowed. That's the point.
You only
The point
need
is,
a couple of minutes, though.
does Shimon own it or do the Yarshim own it? One or the other.
But then they're saying that even if it's a couple of minutes,
A couple of minutes. It makes a difference of who owns it at the time the legitimate transaction took place. Rashi said that he died after. The Rishonim asked, if he died after, then he would have had a taina to be a Goslin. Why is Ruvain not worried about being called a Goslin? But if they bought it after, then he says, the Yarshim, I'm not worried about the Yarshim. I don't care.
Why wouldn't he be worried about the Yarshim? You could easily see a situation where the Yarshim, now that they've inherited this, are taking a closer look at it and saying, wait a minute.
Chaim, that's the next question on the Gemara.
Okay.
Okay, that's the question.
What is the basis?
That's the question. Okay,
What
let's
is the
just finish
basis
that.
for if party A sells a property to party B legitimately? What is the basis for A saying he wants it back? I don't see any basis for that.
But remember, he didn't sell it to him legitimately. He stole the property and he sold him a forged title. There was never a sale. The sale only is legitimized when he goes back to when Reuven, the Goslin, goes back to the original owner and buys it from him. Now the question is, has he post facto legitimized the sale, or is it a new sale and the original sale, it never belonged to Shimon? It doesn't belong to Shimon.
Well, once Reuven buys it from
buyers don't have to know why he's buying
legitimately, then it would belong. It would still belong to Shimon. You know.
No. You're right. Morally, it's not his, but legally, legally, it doesn't belong to Shimon, because when Shimon bought it, he never got title. It was a stolen piece of property. He never acquired title. He's only acquiring title now when the Goslin is buying it from the illegitimate owner. And the halacha is that those rights, those legitimate rights of ownership, are transferred to Shimon, the original buyer. If it wasn't transferred to the original buyer, then that buyer is out of luck, because he bought a stolen piece of property. It was never his. We said right away that it's never a sale, it's a loan. And that's why we have the ribis issue. But if it's a loan and not a sale, Shimon doesn't own it. I know you want to protect Shimon. We all want to protect Shimon, but Shimon never bought it.
But that goes back to the other question. In the other example, you said then, well, if after it was, quote, legitimized, what basis does Reuven have to say he wants the property back?
Good question. You know what he does? Because the theory is that when he buys it from Levi, he steps into Levi's shoes. He is now the owner. What could Levi do? Levi could go back to Shimon and say, I want my property back, and he has to give it to him. So now that he legitimately bought the property, Reuven is now Levi. And Reuven goes back to Shimon and says, I bought it from Levi. I am Levi. I want the property back. Here's your money. Here's your money. I'm not cheating you. Here's your money, but I want the property back because I have Levi's rights. I own Levi's.
If Levi owned it, how would he be able to? If Levi had sold it to Reuven directly, what rights does Levi have?
No. If Reuven had not bought it from Levi, and Levi came back from overseas and sees Shimon sitting in his land, and he goes to Shimon and says, what are you doing here? And Shimon says, I bought it from Reuven. Levi says, what? Reuven doesn't own this property. I do. Please leave. Then he has to leave and go back to the Goslin and get his money back. So now that Reuven is legitimizing his own illegal act by buying it from Levi, so now he doesn't have the responsibility. Oh, I stole stolen property. The question was, can Reuven now stand in the place of Levi and buy it back, or does it automatically belong to Shimon? Rav says the halacha is Shimon owns it. He sold it to Shimon, even though there was not a legitimate transaction because it was a Goslin. He sold him the rights. So now that he bought it, he sold him the rights. And we know that the reason is because of Marzutra or Ravashi. But now we're saying, wait a minute, if Shimon dies, what happens? So now there's a machlokes. Under Marzutra, he doesn't worry about it. Under Ravashi, he does worry about it. Chaim, you asked a good question. What do you mean he doesn't worry about it? Sooner or later, the Yarshim are going to know what's going on here. I mean, they're going to start inquiring and going to find out that Reuven was a Goslin. So let's just finish this Gemara, third line. Sof, at the end of the day, Korele b'nei lokeach Gazlana. You're 100% right, Chaim. Once they find out, they're going to go around and announce that Reuven is a Goslin. So what has he gained here? You think just because he's dealing with the Yarshim, that the Yarshim aren't going to care. They want this piece of land. This is a wonderful piece of land. They're not going to give it up easily. They're going to call him a Goslin. So even according to Mazutra, who says, don't worry about it, we have to worry about it. Okay, so we're going to stop here. But we thought that there was a distinction between Marzutra and Rav Ashi because of the inheritors. Says the Gemara, it's no distinction. The inheritors are going to find out either way.
Or
But
that can't be the distinction. We're
That's-
about to find out what it is.
exactly.
Yeah,
That can't be the distinction. But in the meantime, we asked a very interesting question on Rashi. In Rashi's sequence of events, it doesn't quite work because according to Rashi, if he died, in other words, before Chaim, before coming to the answer that the inheritors are going to know, the kasha on Rashi is, how could you even say that he died after the transaction was legitimized, that he's mamish a Goslin?
right.
We don't have to worry about it now because the Gemara gave a different answer.
Right.
So even the Yorshim are going to call him a Goslin. But assuming that the Yorshim weren't going to call him a Goslin, the Beforshim asked the Rishonim asked the question: how can you say, Rashi, that Shimon wouldn't call him a Goslin? Of course, he would call him a Goslin because this whole thing happened after after it happened. Shimon died, which means he was already the rightful owner, and of course they would call him a Goslin. Teretz says either way, it doesn't work. So so the Gemara is going to pick up Ela Ika Benayu. We're going to have a different reason to distinguish. Now our focus is what's the difference between Marzutra and Rav Ashi. You see, generally in the Gemara, when we have two different answers, we don't necessarily say, yeah, he's just piggybacking. In other words, two answers means there's a distinction between the answers. When two Amoraim give an answer to a kasha, they're not just saying, this, that. In other words, there's got to be a difference between why. Otherwise, he wouldn't come in with a second answer. And just generally speaking, in the Gemara, you have to understand that when there are two interpretations, there's usually a reason why there's a second. So we thought the difference here was whether he'd be called the Goslin or not. The Gemara answers no. Either way, he's going to be called a Goslin, either by the buyer or the buyer's inheritors. So the principle of Goslonis remains. Okay, so that's where we stand, Mr. Shem. But so this is one twist, and I will just give you an advance notice that there are many other twists that the Gemara is going to bring into this as to the fine differences between one circumstance and another. But anyway, Mr. Shem, next week we'll pick up on Tezayin and Aleph.